So I just created this Trello board really quickly, right? Just so that we can capture the stuff here. And this is a good process to follow as you're sitting with your team member and you're working out what is there to do and defining things. Just capture it all in your Trello board as you do it, and then that saves you an extra step of putting it in your Trello board afterwards. So it's a fine way to do things. Okay, so those are our requirements. We'll go ahead and say estimate sizes. We'll do similar to what we did last time. So we'll say small is less than 1 hour. Medium is 1 to 2 hours to complete the work. Large is 2 to 3 hours, and more than 3 hours, break it down further. Okay? No. So definitions, I use the definitions list to define what things are for this project. So defining what estimate sizes are that are my Trello cards. Defining, if I wanted to define the length of sprints or the Git workflow we're going to use, I would put the GitHub repository in there. Let me just share my screen here. So that's the sort of things that I put in definitions. Now, like I said yesterday, this is just the way, this is one example of how to do things. All right? You should do things in a way that makes sense for you and the people that you're working with. And the important thing is that everybody understands the way that you're using the Trello board and that everyone uses it. That's what matters. Okay? All right, so let's create a list called backlog. And again, backlog, the way that I'm using it, is a list of things we could possibly want to do for this app in order to meet the requirements. We may not do all of these things in this iteration of the development of the app. Okay? We might even, and over here in definitions, define what our MVP is. What our minimum viable product. Remember that? Minimum viable product is what we've agreed with the client, whoever we're making this for, as this is at the minimum what we're going to provide to you. All right? There will always be things, extra things that you want, and extra things that the client wants, and you're always going to be working with a limited amount of time and limited number of resources. So you have to define what your MVP is, and then work from there. And what your MVP is may change and grow as you go along. So you can have a card for MVP, and you can say MVP includes user can log in, user can see balance, user can deposit money, user can withdraw money, and user can see transaction history. And then you might have to put more detail in that later. And we also had added a card for future enhancements. And so future enhancements might be things like, may include nice formatting using gems like terminal table or something like that. Might be supporting multiple users. So maybe in our MVP we only support one user. So we might go back to our MVP and clarify that and say user can log in, supports a single user, maybe for the MVP. Okay? So what goes in here is what's negotiated between you and the other stakeholders for this project, which includes the clients and your, if you have a project manager or a product manager, your team lead, the rest of your team, all of those people put together what belongs in the MVP. You all agreed to it, and what could be future enhancements. So we'll have a to-do list. What are some of the other lists that we would have?
Progress.
Yep, in progress. I'm just going to add custom fields to this board. Yeah. In progress, and we had to review and testing and done. Okay, so we start in backlog, and the way that we start, like we started yesterday, was we define user stories, and we already did that a little bit when defining our MVP, right? But we're going to represent them as separate cards. So we have a user story. As a user, I can log in with a password. As a user, what?
I can get a balance.
I can see my balance. What else? Money. As a user, I can deposit. Not necessarily. Not necessarily, because withdrawal and deposit are going to be two different activities. We're going to have we're going to have different methods associated with those. We probably want to test those independently to make sure they each work the way we expect. So I would leave them as two separate user stories. And another thing not to get caught up on is exactly how you're separating these into cards to start with. So, to start with, like, get the user stories out, and then just like we saw yesterday, you might change some things around a bit. You might end up creating multiple cards for one user story. All of that will kind of organically happen as you go along. So what can happen is you get completely blocked, like writer's block or something. You get blocked on, I'm not sure if this should be one card, or is this two cards, or is this a different user story. Just get it out there, and then if it has to change later, it's okay. And then we had another one, which was what? Yeah. Okay, so we have some user stories.
But even I don't change password.
We could, but I would say that that's future enhancement. I would say it's a future enhancement. Okay, so user can change password. And like I said yesterday, we could add a card for that. Okay, we could add a card for that. And then I would want to make sure that I have a way to differentiate in my backlog what is considered MVP that I just haven't scoped yet, and what I'm considering at this point to be future enhancement. So I might just do that with a label. I might just decide that I'm going to put a label on everything that's MVP, or a label on everything that's future enhancement. That's not what I wanted. This is what I wanted. So you can do that. So it's really easy to see in your backlog, and that would be at the bottom. So the things that need to happen, again, we put things in priority order. Now, like we talked about yesterday, we move things from backlog to do once we've done some kind of estimating on it, and it's sort of ready for somebody to take and work on. Okay? So at this point, these things are just a bit too vague for somebody to necessarily take and work on, right? So if we, let's add a card for define classes, and we'll say, let's create a drop down for size. We'll say small, medium, large. We'll give them colors. And oh, I forgot to add it. I hate when I do that. You have to hit that green button or it doesn't do anything. Okay. So now, define classes, I'm going to say is a small task. And let's go ahead and do that now. So we move that into to do. And let's think about what are some of the classes that we're going to need. Yeah, so account, what is account representing, do you think? It's representing like a user and a password? Okay, so we have an account class, and we can take some notes here as we go. So we have a user, a username, and a password, and so would that be a part of the account? It could be. So an account would be associated, I think, with a balance. And a transaction history, right? So an account represents one person's bank account. And then what sort of actions, behaviors, which are going to translate to methods, might we have? What's that? Withdrawals. So are you thinking like, when you say withdrawals, are you saying like we could make withdrawals on the account? Yeah. So we could have yeah, like make, like withdraw and deposit. We can withdraw and deposit money. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so creating the account though, if we think about creating the account, what is it going to be like in code? It'll be like instantiating the account class, won't it? Right, right. So that's probably going to be handled in the initialize method, right? So we don't have to necessarily call that out, but we can say in initialize, we can put some notes here, set username and password and initial balance, which we can decide if we want to set that to 0, which we'll just say, okay, we'll just set an initial balance to 0.
You're gonna have your balance in your withdrawal. You can't withdraw to nothing. You have to withdraw to something. So you can go to withdraw.
Okay, so you're saying that should we have something that you can withdraw money to? I don't know that that's within the scope necessarily of our application. So that's kind of like when you take money out of the bank, you can do whatever you want with it, you know? And we don't necessarily need our banking application to keep up with your wallet too. Yeah, Sam?
Inside actions and behaviors, would you put the ability to change your password? Is that what you put in?
Yeah, we can say that that's a feature enhancement, right? So we'll put that, it's a feature enhancement. This is not part of our MVP.
No.
Yep. Okay, so when we look at this account class and we start to think about the data structures that we need to represent these attributes, is there something here that's more complex than just a basic data type? So username, probably a string, right? Password for the moment, probably a string. Another feature enhancement is we could encrypt passwords, right? So we could add that to our feature enhancements. For now, let's just say it's a string. Our balance is going to be what kind of data type? It'll be a float probably, right? What about transaction history?
It will be
It can be quite complex, can it? Because what is the pieces of information we need to store in a transaction history? We need to know like the date. We need to know the type of transaction. Was it a deposit or withdrawal? And we need to know an amount, don't we? So we could represent that with a hash, but you know how I am.
Next to balance, by the way.
If I've got more than, say again? Oh, I did. Yeah. Stupid cursor. So you know how I feel about these things. If there's more than sort of like two properties of something, create a class for it.
Oh,
Okay? If there's, so this is another thing that signals to me I need another class here. Okay? Because it just gets to be too hard to deal with that data structure. It gets to be too messy. What if we decide later we want to add something else to transaction history, right? We might. And then it's going to be really complicated to change your code that is using this hash data structure. Or an array of hashes is probably what you'd have, actually, wouldn't you? If you tried to represent it all as this one thing, you would have an array of hashes. And then you try to add a new property to that array of hashes, it's going to be messy. Okay, so let's talk about how we would define this transaction history class. So maybe not transaction history, but maybe a transaction, yeah? Because transaction history is really an array of transactions, isn't it? With a date, type, and amount. So if we represented a transaction represents a single transaction made by the user on their account. Yes? Okay. So, yes. Oh, it sure could. It sure could. So we might have an opportunity for subclassing here. So we'll have a think about that as we go. All right? But we definitely have some properties that are common to a transaction, whether it's a deposit or withdrawal. We have a date and we have an amount, at least, right? Those two things are in common. And for me, that warrants having a class that represents those common pieces of information, okay? And, okay, so attributes of our transaction class. So unless we subtype, which we might do, but let's say that we're going to have a type. So this is deposit or withdrawal, isn't it? And we're going to have an amount, and this is going to be what kind of data type?
What?
A float. And then we'll have, what else did we say? A date. And we can make this a time object. As much as I hate them, we'll make it a time object. And then what are some of the actions or behaviors that we would do on a transaction? Well, so this transaction, think about again what it represents. It represents a single transaction. Do we have any actions and behaviors on a single transaction? Probably not, actually. It probably is just a class that represents a piece of data. We don't, maybe something will come, but I don't think at this moment there's any actions or behaviors we need on it. So if we go back to our account class, what we'll have here is just an array of transactions, right? And those will be an array of transaction objects. Remember, just in case you run across the word, this is called class composition. Class composition, when one class definition is composed of some attributes that are actually classes themselves. That's called class composition. Okay, so we have an array of transactions. Let's think some more about what are the actions and behaviors on an account class. Because how are we going to deal with this transaction history? So when we do a deposit, that's going to generate a deposit transaction, won't it?
We're going to have to add it to transaction history, aren't we?
We will, and maybe that'll happen as a part of deposit, or maybe we'll need a helper method called like add transaction that just updates our array. Those are kind of sort of low-level implementation details we won't worry about right now. But how is the user going to interact with this transaction history? Well, they'll want to see it, won't they?
yeah, just
they'll want to see it. So we're going to need like a print transaction history or something, right? We'll need a print transaction history. Okay, so this is the part where I,
We want to print balance or what?
yeah, we also will need a print balance, won't we? Yep, we sure will.
Every time you do something, you want to
Yep.
update the balance.
Will we want to have a okay, we won't worry about that. Okay, so now here's where I would go back to my I would go back to my
Common print.
hmm?
Print could be common, and then transaction history.
It could. So what comes to mind for me though at first is that printing a balance and printing a transaction history are quite different outputs, and we're dealing with two quite different data structures. And I also think about things like a transaction history is made up of transactions. So maybe what I'll want to do is implement a 2S on transaction, and then I can just have a loop that loops through my transactions and calls puts transaction. You know, so those again though are like implementation details that I probably wouldn't worry about just yet. So it's okay, it's totally fine to think about those things, and you will anyway. You'll think about, oh, okay, how would I implement this? Because sometimes when you think about how would I implement it, it'll bring out the need for classes or other things, you know, that you want to think about up front. But here's where I would go back to my requirements and make sure that I'm covering everything. So I want to be able to show a balance, make a deposit, make a withdrawal, and see transaction history. Okay, so I think we've covered that with the things that we've listed. Okay, it doesn't mean we're done, but it means that okay, we at least feels like we're done at this point, and other things may come up. But this is good. So I should have moved that to in progress because we actually did it. And actually, we can move that one all the way across. Since we're doing it together, we're kind of reviewing as we go along, aren't we? Sorry. And so this isn't something that we need to test necessarily, but we can move it to done. Now we need to create some more cards though, and I'm just going to create them here in To Do, because we need a card to define the transaction class, yeah? And a card to, oops, I don't know what just happened there. Another card to define the account class. So out of that exercise we just did, and this happens a lot of times when you're working on a project, we have new work to do based out of the work that we just did. And so we create cards for that work. And so we'll have to define a transaction class, and I'm going to go ahead and size it while we define it. I'm going to say that that's a really small thing to do. We saw the transaction class doesn't have much to it, does it? Defining the account class, however, had a little bit more work to it. We saw that it's really like our workhorse, isn't it, for this application, the account class. So I'm going to go ahead, and I still think that we could do it. Now, with me working on it, I think we could do it within a reasonable amount of time. You know, probably I could do it within an hour. But you have to consider when you're working on something the skills of the resources on your team and who is likely to work on this particular card, and you do need to take into consideration how long it's going to take that person to do it. Okay, so I would go ahead and scope this one as a large, considering most of the people in this room are really new to programming, right? And it's going to take a bit longer to work it out. If you start to work on it and find this is actually going to take me more than 3 hours, then that's when it's time to split up this card, define the account class. Maybe you split it up into defining, okay, I'm going to define these methods, and I'm going to, we'll create another card for defining these other methods. If it feels like it's going to be more than a 3-hour chunk of work for one person to do, okay? And that's just going to be based on your team. You can see how this requires really good communication between the people on your team, being really honest and transparent and open about what your skills are and what you feel comfortable with. And you can see how if that's missing on a team, then things are going to go awry really quickly, right? Somebody who's just trying to look good is like, oh yeah, I can do that in like an hour, no problem, right? That's easy. And then 3 hours later, of course, they're not communicating because now they're embarrassed because 3 hours has gone by and they're still not done. And then, you're like, hey, so what's going on with that? And then you feel like, oh, I better lie about this. My cat's really sick today, so I haven't been able to work on it or something, right? And things start to fall apart because then you lose integrity and accountability. Now your Trello board isn't worth very much because it's not actually reflecting reality. And the other person starts to wonder, they're not working on it. They said they haven't been able to work on it. Maybe I should work on it. And so they say, okay, well, how about I work on that? Because we need to get it done. It's the next in our list of priorities. And, that's fine. And you're like, oh, actually, I just spent like 3 hours on it, though. I don't want somebody else to work. It just gets really unworkable. So even when you go out and work for someone else, it's really important to just be transparent and honest. And when you're struggling with something, to say, I thought I'd be able to do this, but I'm really struggling with this piece of it. This is what I've done to try to work it out myself, and this is where I'm still stuck. Here's the question I have. Can you help me answer this question? So if you communicate that way, attempting to do it on your own, when you'll feel bad about taking a senior dev's time. You feel like, I don't want to bother them. They look really busy. They will always be busy. They always look busy, right? So you're like, oh, I don't want to bother them, and I don't want to look like I can't do this. But if you go through the steps of trying to work it out yourself first, and you document, what you're trying, just little notes to yourself, so you can go to them and say, I tried this, I looked here, I looked there, I'm still stuck on this thing. Can you help me with this specific thing? Not go to them and say, I don't really know how to do this. Give them something specific that it demonstrates that you're trying, that you're keen to learn, that you really did all that you could to try to work it out yourself, and you value their time. So you're just asking them the specific question, and then you listen to how they help you. You really pay attention, take notes if you need to, so that you're less likely to have to ask them the same question again next time. And that is going to have them really value you as a junior dev. Okay? They expect that they need to teach you things. They expect that you don't know everything, but they also expect you to be honest and transparent, and not pretend like you know things that you don't know things, or just flat out lie, because it just means the project loses integrity, and everybody loses out when that happens. Okay? It makes everybody look bad. All right, that's the end of my soapbox talk. Just a little advice there for how you should work when you go out into the wild. Okay, so now that we've got these scoped, we've got them in the to-do list, we're not going to go through defining these today, okay? We're just kind of going through this process of how we break it down. Can you see from this point that the next steps, are you pretty clear about what the next steps would be for you? You would define the transaction class. That'd be pretty straightforward, hopefully. Then you define the account class. Less straightforward, okay? There's some work to do in here. You may find when you define the account class that, like we found yesterday, it would make sense to subclass transaction, to have a withdraw that extends transaction and a deposit that extends transaction, so we could make our code drier. It would start to become clear when you implement your account class, if that makes sense, okay? And then you start to work out those details. So I'm going to stop there with this example, all right? And you guys can, you have access to this board. You can have a look at it. You can sort of use it as a little bit of an example when you work on your app or other things. And we'll do this exercise again with some other examples on other days, okay? Different types of examples, so we can get that practice. All right, any questions about what we just talked about there? Yes, Aiden?
So when you're to do list, is that saying you define the transaction cost first before when you get time?
Yes. So it makes sense to me, since the transaction class is used by the account class, that I would define the transaction class first. That's right.
Might be smarter than you get the basics of the account class first as it's kind of your
Well, look, you could, but the transaction class is super straightforward, right? The transaction class has just, 3 attributes? And that's it. That's all it is. You know, there's nothing else to it. It'll take you 5 minutes to knock that out, or 10 minutes. You know, and you can move it over. Yeah.
Makes more sense to me.
Okay, well, you should.
Once you make the account
Yeah.
class, it tells you the information.
I think what you'd find is you would start to define the account class, and you'd have to stop and go define the transaction class, and then come back to the account class. Okay, so I think that's what you would find would happen.
Transaction class is just the behavior of how the account works.
The transaction class is, so if we look back at this one, and probably a good idea is when you create these cards to copy from your defined classes. What happened? Oh, I didn't save it. Ah, that's nice. I kept it for me. So you would copy this bit into your card for the transaction class. So you've got it handy. So a transaction just represents a single transaction made by the user on their account. It has these 3 attributes: a type, which is one of deposit or withdrawal, an amount, and a date. All it does is represent, it's really a data structure that represents a transaction. That's all that it is. And it just keeps us from using a nasty hash that could get really complicated. So likewise, I would copy out this bit that we came up with for account, and I would paste it into my account card. So you've got it there handy. And then, you know, again, what goes into do is stuff that we've clearly defined and scoped with a size.
In transaction, would you? Is that a behaviour of account? The balance?
It's not a behavior. It's really just a piece of data. It's a piece of data that we keep up with in an array in the account class. So in the account class, we'll have a transaction history, which will just be an array of transactions, a collection of deposits and withdrawals.
But with the balance, you just want the amount in our account to.
That's right. That's right. So the balance is one thing. The balance is a number that reflects the current balance.
Yeah.
The transaction history is a record of the transactions that have gotten us to that balance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the transaction history is a list of transactions, which then we can print for the user. We can print something that says, on this day at this time, you made a deposit of this much money. We might want to keep track of the balance in that transaction history too, might we? Possibly. Because sometimes in a transaction history you'll see this amount was deposited and this was the resulting balance. This amount was withdrawn and this was the resulting balance. So that's already something else we may want to add to the transaction class. Maybe not, it depends on your implementation, but we could put here consider including balance as part of the transaction.
Well, you would have to, wouldn't you?
Maybe.
Because usually a transaction has like
The
an
date.
opening balance.
Yeah, an opening balance. So maybe you'll have an opening balance and a closing balance. So maybe not just balance, but start balance, end balance. Perhaps, yeah. It depends. So those are going to be some implementation details that you may decide to change later.
Yeah.
Okay, you may decide to leave it out. It depends on how you use this transaction object in your account class. Okay? All right, any other questions about that?
At what point would you archive the card versus leaving it in the done list?
So you're talking about like transaction history? At what point would
I was
you?
talking about Trello in general.
Oh, general, right. Okay, gotcha. I guess when you're not going to use it anymore, when the project's done and dead, yeah, then you could archive it, you know, when you don't feel like you're ever going to look at it again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't really
Yeah.
archive individual cards on a board necessarily? Like,
So
you try-
cards, if it's a card that you decided you're not going to do and it doesn't serve any purpose to keep it captured that you considered it.
Yeah.
So sometimes there might be things, you know, that you put in backlog and you never get to them. Sometimes, we even had this happen on our the project that I showed the other day, our MC dashboard project. We got to the point where we had like 100 things in this backlog ideas, and it got to be unmanageable. And we're like, okay, we're just going to archive some of these things that we know we're never going to do, you know, and just because the board got like unwieldy and untidy.
Yeah.
So I think that it makes sense in that case. Or if you make a card by mistake, or you make a card and, you know, you realize really quickly, no, actually that's not how that would work. It's just going to confuse people if we have this card here. Let's get rid of it. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to our first. Actually, we're going to do some slides, and then we'll come back to our cafe example. But first, let's talk about TDD. TDD kind of sounds like a disease, doesn't it?
So TDD.
Yeah,
Oh, I
TDD.
thought you said TBD. So
Yeah.
to be decided.
Yeah.
TDD does sound like something you don't want.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I don't want to do the one with test unit. I think I have another one.
Screen and then meet at the moment?
I am.
Okay. Is there a link to that on the slide?
There is in every one. Yeah.
Awesome. Just because that hurts.
Oh, here we go. Nope. Okay. We're not going to look at all of these slides because I talk about unit testing, which we're not going to do at this point. Let me let you in. Oh, that was Jack. So we're just going to go through some of these slides, okay? I thought I put together some other slides for this, but I can't find them right now, so I will do. Okay.